This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Tashal Brown, Assistant Professor of Urban Education and Secondary Social Studies in the College of Education at the University of Rhode Island. Her research focuses on race, ethnicity, and gender in relation to equity and justice in educational contexts, and how the cultivation and enactment of critical literacies and liberatory pedagogies across K-12 schools, community-based spaces, and teacher education shape the perspectives, experiences, and actions of youth and educators. In this conversation, we explore the centrality of the study of childhood in Black studies, the place of education in the field, and the transformative power of multidisciplinary approaches to understanding Black girlhood. Good afternoon, Tashal. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm all right today. We're recording this in the first snow day of the academic year for me, which is the first day of school, actually, first day of classes here in Maryland, where we're under ice and snow and hopefully be thawed by the time this comes out. But really, I'm really happy to be starting the first official week of my semester with this podcast recording. I think the kind of work you do is super interesting. It's really important for Black studies to really think hard about questions of education, and you really bring that. We share time. We didn't cross paths, but we share time at Hampshire College and Pioneer Valley and all of that. So for all those reasons, really happy that you made the time. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and welcome to the Black Studies Podcast.
Thank you so much.
So we'll have a chance, of course, to talk about your work and, how you think about the field of Black studies and how those two things connect. But I wanted to start really with the more personal question, which is to ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And ultimately also the question of what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Well, as you mentioned, I went to Hampshire College, which was a non-traditional small liberal arts school. And at Hampshire, you could design your own major. And while I was there, I decided that I wanted to study comparative expressions of Black identity through the arts. So I took courses that focused on Black history, culture, creative expression, things like African American literature, jazz, the cultural and literary history of hip-hop, Caribbean poetry, changing images of Blacks in film. I took lots of different courses at Hampshire and also across the 5 colleges, UMass Amherst, Mount Holyoke, Smith. So I took many different types of courses. At the same time, I was really drawn to questions about Jamaica and the African diaspora. I was born in Jamaica and I was raised in the Bronx, so I was always trying to make sense of those layered identities and what it meant to move between cultures and spaces. At Hampshire, we also compiled we had to complete a year-long senior project. It's similar to our thesis, but we call it Div 3 at Hampshire. There's Div 1, 2, and 3. And
dude, I'm getting like bits of nostalgia here. Yes, I love the Div 3 process. But.
Yeah, the Div 3 process was really amazing and actually pretty life-changing for me. So for my Div 3, I wanted to explore Jamaican music and culture in London. I ended up spending 4 months in London interviewing Jamaican musicians and DJs who were active in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And that experience was incredibly formative. It deepened my interest in how migration, place, and politics shape cultural production, and it directly led me into my master's work at SUNY Albany, where I continued to study Jamaican music and culture. So across both my undergraduate and master's work, I was really driven by questions about culture, identity, and diaspora, and I wanted to understand how the material conditions of people's lives shape the music, art, and cultural practices that emerge both in Jamaica and across the diaspora. On a personal level, this was also very connected to how I grew up. I was raised in a Jamaican household that was very musically rich, largely because of my dad. So my dad was very into music, lots of different genres. So bringing together my love of music with my desire to learn about Jamaica and the Caribbean felt very natural to me. After completing my BA and MA, I spent several years working with young people in schools and community spaces in New York. And that work shifted my trajectory, and it pushed me towards pursuing a PhD in curriculum instruction and teacher ed at Michigan State. And while on the surface, it might seem like this work is disconnected from my earlier work in Africana studies, for me, it was more of a continuation. I was still asking questions about equity, representation, thinking about critical literacies, and whose knowledge gets valued in educational spaces. I also realized that Black studies has profoundly shaped how I understood myself, education, and the world. The visibility, representation, and critical frameworks I encountered in my Black studies courses and research shifted something in me, both personally and intellectually. And they gave me the language to understand identity, power, but also imagination around what's possible. And that continues to guide my teaching, research, writing, and my creative projects.
So, thank you for that. It's totally really interesting, and I love these moments where education and something about not just not only the seriousness, but also the playfulness of like home and community like come together, which you really I think articulated there really well. I do have to just as a sort of Pioneer Valley nostalgia moment. Did you actually, you mentioned the 5 colleges, but did you actually take courses at Smith? Because that's the bus ride nobody ever wants to take.
No, I definitely took courses at Smith. I actually took
Awesome.
I took one class at Smith. And I took punk. It was about punk rock, actually. I took a punk rock class at Smith.
Well, I used to just harangue my students. Because the Smith faculty is fantastic. It's a beautiful campus. It's great to get out of town in terms of going from Amherst over to Northampton. But students were like, I can't do the bus ride. I was just like, put on your headphones, read a book, whatever. So I had to put you on the spot. So
it's nothing to me. I'm a New Yorker, so I grew up taking the train from the Bronx into Manhattan for high school. I've worked in different boroughs, as a young person, 14, 15 years old, taking the train, so.
Thank you. See, we should have crossed paths, so I could have sent you out there to guilt trip my students for being podunk small town people about travel. But I'm interested just as a follow-up, like I said, I love the continuity of the sort of playfulness, but also seriousness of home, culture, origin points in Jamaica, and study. And I'm interested I wanted to hear if did you have a sense when you were growing up that these things that surrounded you were possible or actual sort of intellectual endeavors, or was it sort of college helped you, education, whether it's college or graduate school, sort of helped you see, the intellectual work that was going on and that listening and that creative work of musicians and the creative interplay of like homes and communities with music? Like, did you always have a sense that this was real, like identity and idea making, or was it sort of study that sort of brought it to your attention?
I think at Hampshire, it made me realize that this could be an academic pursuit in a way. Yeah. I mean, I was doing things with music in high school already. I had a zine that I started with a couple of my friends in high school, and we were interviewing punk rock bands and things for several years doing this zine. So I, at the time, saw music as in a music journalism kind of way, because I was doing that in high school and into college. But I think at Hampshire, I saw the possibility of more of an academic pursuit and thinking about other things in relation to identity and history and, socio-political factors. And I wasn't really looking at it from that perspective when I was doing my zine.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I love that. First of all, more teenagers making zines and thinking about journalistic relationships to their passions. I love that. And I love that. It's a great sort of path of continuity. I could see why you would get into education as a field. So I'm interested in a few minutes to hear a little bit more about that. And, you mentioned that that your BA and MA are in Black Studies. And so I wanted to ask you just what is that portrait of Black Studies that you work with? Because, of course, Black Studies has a tension built into its practice and idea and ideals. One of which is its commitment to an intellectual life, that it's a place where, Black history, Black art, Black literature, and so on can be studied, right, without having to sort of compete or sort of be on the edges of a discipline, right? The Black studies is a place where the Black intellectual tradition lives and breathes and is reproduced. And that was part of the demand for Black studies at its origin point, was that there be this place on campuses. But of course, there's also the political demands of Black studies, a commitment to a certain vision of liberation and a set of political prescriptions that come from that moment, the same moment of the founding of Black studies, where Black liberation struggle had radicalized and really collapsed some of those boundaries we might draw between study in the classroom and prescriptive action and mobilization and community. So, I think Black studies still has that tension between intellectual pursuits and political commitments. I don't want to say contradiction, but they exist in some tension. So sort of in the context of that origin and our inheritance of it in the field, I'm interested in what the portrait of Black studies is that you work with.
So to your point in thinking more about the origins of Black studies, I believe that I don't think it's possible, even desirable, to separate the political impact of Black studies from its development and its intellectual and expressive traditions. From the very beginning, as you said, it's like really rooted in the lived experiences of Black people and struggles for justice. So politics and knowledge production have always been intertwined. And when I think about like the tenuous space Black study has held in so many ways, like many programs have faced ongoing threats to their legitimacy and survival within colleges and universities. And we're also seeing similar sorts of dynamics play out even at the K-12 level, where like most recently there was attacks on the initiative with the AP African American Studies course. And then those movements, those kinds of issues remind us that Black studies has never been just about ideas in the abstract. It's always been about like power, access, and whose knowledge matters in educational spaces. So at the same time, Black studies has continuously demonstrated the depth and significance of what becomes possible when inquiry and creative work center Black life, Black ways of knowing. The scholarship, art, and theory that emerged from African-centered and Black-focused approaches give us powerful tools to understand the past and make sense of the present, and also imagine different futures. And so for me, the meaning and purpose of Black studies lies in holding all of that together. It's a field that requires us to think rigorously and creatively while also acting with an awareness of political and social impact. The intellectual work fuels the political work, and the political realities sharpen and ground the intellectual work. So they're moving together. That tension isn't something to resolve. It's something to stay in, to negotiate thoughtfully, and to embrace as a part of what makes Black studies both necessary and also powerful.
Yeah, it's funny. I've said this in a number of episodes. When Ashley and I were formulating these questions when we started this project, I think that distinction felt a little bolder. But I think, we're recording this in January 2026. I think the difference between just reading about Black life and political intervention, that has been completely blurred by our climate. Just, as you said, just even centering the experiences of Black people is such a deep political statement. It always has been, but boy, has our awareness of that really been sharpened lately.
We see like erasure like happening in real time. It's not to say that it wasn't always a thing, but we see how some of that has like, you thought, okay, we're making some progress. But just the other day, I think it was in Philadelphia, they were erasing or taking some things off of like a plaque around a national
it was George Washington's home. They were taking off the references to slavery.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is wild, because not even George Washington would have wanted that. I mean, it wasn't like he was ashamed of it.
Yeah, so it's like erasure in real time, and it's just so bold and blatant.
It's astonishing. We could go on for hours about that. But I also really appreciate the way you put it, the tension between the political intervention and intellectual life. You describe the way they have an interdependency and a sort of mutual need for mutual need, right? That politics and intellectual life can't exist without the other. But I also really like that you put it that we just have to sit with that tension rather than resolve it. I think that word you use, sharpened, I really like that. I find that so many in my time in Black Studies, which is now like 25 years, emerging political moments do change the way I and my colleagues approach a classroom, the way we use examples, the way we talk, the way we read, the things we think are urgent in our curriculum and all of that. So when you said that about sort of sitting inside that tension and letting it sharpen us one way or another as scholars or as political actors, it resonates as I think what's special and really often difficult about Black Studies, because that's a lot to demand of us, actually, to have that kind of dexterity. Well, let me ask then about, this is a continuation of this in many ways, to ask about your work. Your work is concerned with questions of gender, questions of pedagogy theory, and how race impacts each. Obviously, the field of education. And there's so much that can be generated out of that for the field of Black Studies. And so I'm interested in your reflection on how you see your work and the collage of these approaches and concerns, how you see it situated in terms of the past of Black Studies. How does it fit in the history of the field? But also, what new horizons does it open up? What boundaries do you think it pushes?
A lot of my work centers on the experiences of Black girls and girls of color, especially looking at how their racialized and gendered experiences show up in schools and community-based learning spaces. And I'm really interested in what happens when young people participate in educational environments that intentionally focus on questions of power, oppression, identity, and social justice. In my research, I examine how those kinds of learning experiences shape how students see themselves, how they understand the world around them, and how they develop a sense of agency. So I see this work as deeply connected to the origins of Black Studies. Black Studies as a field was born out of activism, out of Black students and faculty demanding access to curriculum that center Black histories, Black knowledge, Black lived experience. In many ways, I see my work as carrying that same spirit forward, just in different educational spaces and with younger learners. So, mostly like middle school, high school in particular. One of the things I've learned through my research is how powerful transformative learning experiences can be for Black youth and other youth of color. When students are given space to engage with socio-political issues that directly affect their lives, it helps make visible the systems, the structures, and ideologies that are often normalized. And because they're so normalized, they become invisible. So unfortunately, these kinds of conversations and learning opportunities are still very rare at the K-12 level. So a big part of my work is about creating and supporting curricular opportunities in K-12 schools and community spaces that advance ethnic studies, critical consciousness, and a deep sense of belonging. I think this matters so much because for many students, the first time they encounter Black Studies is in college, if they get there at all, right? So at the K-12 level, you're not having, for the most part, I'm thinking about teaching in New York, for example, teaching in the Bronx, teaching in Harlem. The schools that I went to and the schools that I taught in, we didn't have access to things like Black Studies, African American Studies, any sort of electives like that, so that wasn't even a thing. So for many students, including myself, I didn't get to encounter Black Studies or ethnic studies kind of content or curriculum until I was in college, So as a former K-12 educator and educational researcher, and now also a teacher-educator, I'm aware of how Black students are pushed out of schools and how anti-Blackness in curriculum, policies, and everyday school practices plays a major role in the push out of Black students. So for me, the New Horizon isn't necessarily about inventing something brand new. It's more about doubling down on what we already know helps Black students thrive, and that's culturally sustaining curriculum, a strong sense of history and self, and the development of a critical lens to understand and navigate the world. And at the heart of all of this is collaboration for me. I'm really committed to working alongside administrators, educators, young people, families, and communities to make these kinds of learning opportunities more accessible accessible and widespread, especially at the K-12 level, because I understand like young people will spend so much of their formative years in these spaces. And so it's really important for them to be able to see themselves and to develop a critical lens in which to see the world and understand the systems and how to navigate them.
Yeah, so many. I love that. So many things that you were talking about. It just that will stick with me and have been on my mind a lot over the last year. One of the things that I think a lot about that you spoke directly to is how much we in Black Studies are indebted to students. I mean, this field only exists because 19-year-olds rebelled against everything and contested everything at their university, all the authorities in their lives, and said, we want a place here. And so for me, a question is, what is the place of the student, right? Just as a category in the Black Studies imagination and our practice and our conception of ourselves. And that notion of the student, as you point out, is expansive and voracious. It's not just an 18 to 22-year-old, right? It is also K through 12. And, Black Studies certainly was not a demand only to study or to make things available to 18 and up, right? And so I love that idea of, that the concerns you have go back to the origins of Black Studies, but in some ways push it to its expansive sort of nature. And so, thinking that way, intra-podcast, Rahman Culver and Tony Lewis have been on the podcast. They're two Maryland educators who have tried to bring Black Studies to Maryland, a couple of Maryland high schools and curricula. And I think, for example, Tony had taken a group of students this past fall semester to a talk that Ruha Benjamin gave, and there were 16 and 17-year-olds, and she gave this talk at University of Maryland. There were probably 350 people there, and there were maybe 24, like 16, 17-year-olds listening to her talk about race and AI and Black Studies, and I had just happened to be sitting near them just by chance, and they were just buzzing about it. I mean, they were just high off that talk. They couldn't believe it. It just goes to your point. I mean, Black Studies is transformative in the ways that you talked about, being able to put together, your zine activity, but also the joys and pleasures of your community and household, right? It sort of all assembles, and it's like, why wait? You could see that assembling for them. It was just phenomenal. Yeah. So I'm sorry to go on, but it really strikes me as such an important aspect of Black Studies that strangely doesn't get talked about, which is how to think about student and education together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that.
And, this is in some ways this continuation of the question, as you said, your BA and your MA are in Black Studies, but then your and your PhD is in education. So you have a sort of interesting movement in your work, your education, from non-disciplinary work to disciplinary work, right? And now, you work in education and Black Studies. And so I'm interested how that movement between disciplinary and non-disciplinary modes of education and the way those shape how we approach research projects, how we imagine the very project of education, how you think that movement between discipline and non-discipline has impacted how you conceive a research project, but also how it has impacted how you conceive a classroom.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think moving between Africana studies and education has really shaped the way I think about research, writing, and teaching. Coming into this work as a former middle and high school teacher in New York City, combined with my training as an educational researcher and my grounding in Africana studies, has made me deeply value interdisciplinary thinking and also being widely read across different fields. Education is a practice-based field, so a lot of my work is empirical. Like most of my research is empirical studies. I care about what's actually happening in classrooms and community spaces, not just in theory. Practice is really important, right? At the same time, I'm very intentional about grounding that work in critical frameworks. So I'm drawing heavily on Black feminist theory, race-based analysis like critical race theory, especially when I'm studying spaces where critical consciousness raising is central and where humanizing and justice-oriented approaches are shaping curriculum and instruction. In my research, I'm always asking, What's working here? How are young people experiencing these learning environments? What does it look like when educators take critical theories seriously in their practice? And what kinds of learning become possible because of that? That combination of theory and lived on-the-ground experience really comes from straddling both disciplinary training and education and the more expansive disciplinary tradition of Black studies. That same approach shows up in my teaching. And so in my own classroom, I draw on what I learned from my research, but also intentionally bring in materials across disciplines and modalities like music, oral histories, visual culture, community knowledge, not just traditional academic texts. That also shapes how I design assignments because I want students to engage knowledge in multiple ways, not just through writing papers. My background in Black studies has also strengthened my commitment to community-centered teaching. I'm very aware of how absent Black experiences and perspectives are in mainstream K-12 curriculum. So I try to be very intentional about bringing those perspectives into my courses. That also means collaborating directly with educators, young people, and community organizations. So one example of this was a project I worked on a few years ago with the 8th grade ethnic studies teacher here in Providence, Rhode Island, along with the Rhode Island Black storytellers. So we worked together to design and facilitate an 8-week unit focused on the legacy of Christiana Bannister. She was a Narragansett and African-American hairdresser, entrepreneur, abolitionist, and philanthropist. In the unit, we highlighted both Christiana and her husband, Edward Bannister, and their impact in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, while also centering the role of barbershops and hair salons in social justice movements. And in this unit, we brought community members into the classroom to share their lived experience and expertise, and students also interviewed their families and community members. And so in that way, the project made local Black history visible, while also uplifting oral histories and the everyday work of people organizing for racial justice and social change. For me, that project really captures how my Africana studies background and my training and education come together in practice. It's about honoring Black knowledge, centering community, and centering learning experiences that are both intellectually rigorous and deeply connected to people's lived realities.
I love that. I mean, I yes, I mean, just what you said at the end. This is like the promise of Black studies is to push these boundaries, push aside these boundaries between, what counts as knowledge and community practices, right? That the community practices are knowledge production, and I love that you get not only yourself but also students in the middle of that, with actual ability to take account, right, honor it, but also. I imagine for many of them see it for the first time, like this thing that maybe they found familiar. They're like, "Oh, there's more going on here than I thought," or hopefully confirms their suspicions that this is an entire knowledge production.
Yeah, it was really amazing. It was one of the best. I had such a good time working with this particular 8th grade ethnic studies teacher and the Rhode Island Black storytellers, and with the kids being in the classroom multiple days a week. We had a good time, and I realized for them just the sort of joy that was happening in the room, and the sort of curiosity that was being sparked with the guest speakers that came in. They were like, "Oh my God," they were like, "Miss, how do you know so much about your family and your history?" Because I had one of my friends come in, and she is Narragansett and African American herself, and she went through her family history, and she talked about she has a whole article around the ways in which the state of Rhode Island and the federal government worked to suppress the Narragansett people, right, and their sovereignty, and the different policies and laws that were put into place. And she also used that as an opportunity to trace her family's history and make these different connections. And these are 8th grade ethnic studies students, and they were just amazed. They were like, "Oh my goodness, Miss, how do you know all this stuff?" Yeah, they're really amazed.
I mean, look, 8th graders are hard to impress. I have a 9th grader who was recently an 8th grader. They're hard to impress, but to get them excited about the accumulation of knowledge is itself an enormous victory. And to get it around things of such massive significance around race, community, nation, state, all of that. I love that. I bet you're going to hear about that from those 8th graders over the years.
I hope so.
Yeah, that will be a pleasure every time. I can only imagine. Well, let me ask two more questions for you, two sort of broad questions. The first one is, thinking about the history of Black studies, what do you think the field has done well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Whew. Oof.
Everybody's always
Whew.
stressed out about the not particularly well. I always say fields never do everything well. That's why it continues to evolve. But
I know, but it always feels like, oh, am I the person to be like saying what is not doing well? So,
yes, you
um, yeah, yeah.
today you are.
Uh, so yeah, that is a big question. But one thing I think Black Studies has done really well is expand how we imagine freedom, liberation, and Black life itself. I'm thinking, for example, about work like Robin D.G. Kelley and the writing on freedom dreaming, and Tina Camp's scholarship on fugitivity and refusal, and the broader conversations that have grown out of that work. Those ideas have helped shift the gaze towards centering Black ways of seeing, knowing, and being unapologetically. They've also opened up so many creative and intellectual possibilities for thinking about what freedom can look like, feel like, and sound like in everyday life. I think that turn toward imagination is powerful. Activating our collective imagination around justice, liberation really matters. There's joy in that work, but there's also real possibility. It reminds us that Black Studies isn't only about documenting harm and struggle, even though that's important. It's also about building, dreaming, and creating new futures. I think also about, you mentioned Ruha Benjamin earlier, and she has the book on imagination, and I read that book as well. And so I think it's really important. Like, a lot of this work is thinking about like other possibilities. In terms of Black Studies, what Black Studies hasn't done well or as well, I want to say this humbly and with respect to all the work that is already being done. But I do think perhaps there's more room for deeper collaboration across departments, programs, and institutions. I'd love to see stronger networks that help us support one another in meaningful ways, especially when it comes to research, scholarship, and curriculum development that strengthens Black studies in higher ed while also building more solid pathways in the K-12 space. Because, the K-12 space, that's like where like a lot of my heart is and a lot of my work. Yep. I think we had some real momentum around this in recent years, but the current political climate has made this work even harder to do. If you think about the increasing attacks on ethnic studies, conversations about race and racism, attacks on DEI, a lot of the progress that was made has been slowed down or even rolled back. And that is very real. Like, we see how a lot of this is like being rolled back. Even the language that we have to use and the way that folks need to censor themselves in some capacity. But at the same time, I know the power of this work, and I know many other Black studies scholars do too. So for me, the question becomes, how do we keep going? How do we sustain each other, especially early career scholars who are navigating really difficult institutional contexts that may not fully value their work? That's where collaboration and coalition building feel essential. And, we need each other. We need shared resources, shared strategies, and collective care. And I think that's one of the most important frontiers and maybe the frontier is not the right word, but like that's one of the most important things that we should be thinking about as we move forward in Black studies.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more on this need of the field to reconnect, nationally and even locally and across campuses around coalition and support. I love that you pointed out that, junior scholars or scholars getting started in their career, and, what would it mean for Black studies to take, as a field across institutions, to take up support for those kinds of scholars who, as you said, may be struggling to get their work heard or appreciated and all of that. I think a really striking example, it's like a bold, loud example. So that's part of why I mention it. But, what happened at Indiana University with basically closing down this historically incredibly important Black Studies program, PhD program, master's program, undergraduate program with an incredible faculty of an amazing institutional and national history. And there was no sense that the field of Black Studies could respond to that. right? And I think the attacks on AP, African American Studies, and the elimination of it. I mean, a couple of my colleagues at University of Maryland worked on the project. I didn't myself, but they put in a lot of work on that. And the field of Black Studies did not have a way of mobilizing as a response. And it just comes to your point of, where is our sense of solidarity and coalition and ability to mobilize? And in this, we couldn't need it more than in this moment. That is for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we do. And it's even helpful to think about how we strategize in the work that we're doing, right? Like a lot of us are facing similar challenges, but it'd be helpful to hear from other people about what they're doing, how they're meeting those challenges. I think that's critical for us to do, because it is almost all hands on deck in lots of ways.
I mean, it's super anecdotal and very small, but in some ways everything is very small at these kinds of moments. But I had a conversation just over Messenger with a couple of friends at other institutions who were struggling with how to deal with diversity and equity issues at their universities when they were banned from sort of using this language. And they were sort of, just sort of said, hey, we're interested in what you're doing there. Here's what we're doing here, or what the institution is doing. I mean, they themselves are not administrators, but I shared some of the things that University of Maryland is doing, and I heard what they had to say, and we all immediately had this sense that even just the practice of equity work was changed in our we're all do searches and promotion cases and these sorts of things and hires of all kinds. And it got changed just in an exchange of 5 or 6 messages. And I was like, we don't have a national model. We're really just a couple of people on Facebook exchanging messages rather than the ability to mobilize in a really significant way. And we need allies in this moment. I hate to be really mundane about it, but we don't have allies in politics. We've estranged ourselves in so many ways in Black Studies from communities, as an institution we have. Centering some imagination on how to make those coalitions work. I think you're absolutely right on that. So maybe that's already a response or already the answer to this last question I have for you, which is thinking in a Black Studies context. What is the one issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or the question you would want us to all be asking?
I'm really interested right now in questions around coalition building and the African diaspora. In my current research, I'm focusing on a core set of questions that explore the spaces, practices, and experiences Black youth see as most influential in shaping their racial and cultural knowledge and their sense of identity. And what do they want Black history education to look like, especially in ways that reflect their lived realities, affirm who they are, and foster a deep sense of belonging? I've been taking what I'm learning from the interviews and focus groups with Black high school and college students and using that to pilot a short Black Studies summer program that actually responds to what young people are asking for. The goal is to move beyond just studying youth perspectives instead create something that puts their ideas into practice. What's really been powerful about me trying to design and conceptualize this program is that it will bring together Black youth from different cultural backgrounds, African American, Jamaican, Cape Verdean, Ghanaian, Nigerian, all here in Rhode Island, to engage in conversations about Black histories, Black experiences, and their own stories. My hope is that this kind of space helps young people see themselves, their histories, and their futures beyond the white gaze, and in ways that center their humanity and complexity. We're living, because right now we're living in a moment where divisive rhetoric is spreading rapidly, especially through social media. And I see what folks are engaging with. We're seeing an increase in xenophobia, anti-Blackness, misogyny, and other harmful ideologies. And I think we have to ask ourselves some hard questions. How can our work help repair fractures that are rooted in white supremacist narratives? How do we build strong coalitions across difference instead of allowing those divisions to deepen? Because I definitely see a lot of this happening. And especially if you think about the space of social media, things like YouTube or Instagram or, Twitter, all these different platforms, people are spewing so much hatred. You'll see even other Black folks and the diaspora wars, a lot of this stuff is allowed to spread pretty rapidly within the digital space. I also think we need to be asking how we use the very tools that are often doing harm, like social media, to interrupt destructive narratives and share more liberatory ones. And how do we do this work not only in classrooms and universities, but in community spaces with families, young people, and in everyday life? A lot of us are already doing this work, so I'm not saying that we're not. A lot of us are already doing this work, but I think there's also a call for us to be louder and more visible about it. And so I'll be honest, that's something I'm still working through myself. Putting yourself out there publicly, especially online, can feel so vulnerable.
Yeah.
But I see this moment and even being part of this Black Studies podcast as a part of that practice of showing up more fully and being present in public space. So I really appreciate the opportunity and the space to be in this conversation with you today. And I just want to thank you for the invitation.
Oh, please. I mean, this is a fantastic place to wrap up. I mean, what you're reminding us of is take, the social media context, the internet context is a context of entering community space. And it's one of the more frightening ones because it has a kind of anarchy that in person doesn't. But it's important because, as you say, somebody is already there. And so, and there's a lot of harm being done by what's there. So what does it mean to ask ourselves, how can we be in that space in a way that is, as you said, is liberatory rather than damaging? I love that as a place to end. And I mean, that's the aspiration of the podcast, that it does like a little tiny bit of entering that space in all of these ways. And this is a fantastic contribution to that. I really appreciate your time so much, but your thoughtfulness and insights across this conversation have just been amazing. This is a great part of the series. I really thank you for it.
Thank you so much. Again, I had a wonderful time chatting with you.
Well, it's good to talk with you as well, and good luck starting your semester and all of these ice and snowstorms. You're up in New England, so this is what you do, but I remember those days.
No, we had like 20 inches, so like it's, yeah,
excuse me. Okay,
it's pretty significant.
We had 8, and it's like Armageddon here, so. But great to talk to Tashal, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. You too.
Bye-bye.